How can women who waited too long to have children find meaning in their lives once they realize their mistake? How can we cope with the regret? Jesus, that's a hard question. Well, there are other avenues to meaning, right? I mean, that's the first thing to realize, is that there's intimate relationship, there's familial relationships that aren't in accordance with children, there's other people that you can serve, there are other children that you can serve. So what you have to do, because intimate relationships are so important, and I'm including the close familial, I'm not talking about sexual relationships, I'm talking about very close social relationships. The thing about having children, if you're lucky, is that you have a relationship there of a depth that you don't get anywhere else, with the possible exception of your parents and siblings and your partner. But there's something about the child relationship that's even more fundamental, because the thing about having a child is that if you have any sense, as soon as you have a child, you are no longer the most important person, right? You're no longer the person that you have primary responsibility for. It's now your child. And that produces a psychological transformation, and it produces a relationship of a depth that can't be easily duplicated elsewhere. But it's not like that's the only thing that there is to do in life. There are other relationships, and I would say what you do is you foster them to the degree that that's possible. And maybe you can find other kids to serve. There's always the possibility of volunteering for hospitals or working in places where children need service. So that's a possibility as well. And so there are a variety of sources of meaning in people's lives, and they're not unlimited. There's career, there's education, there's what you do that's meaningfully engages you outside of work. There's your social relations, your friends, and so forth. And so maybe you have 5 legs to stand on, and you missed one because you didn't have kids, or maybe you missed 2 because kids are a big deal. But that doesn't mean the rest of them aren't accessible to you. And so you optimize your functioning along the dimensions that are left to you. And then I would also say, maybe you try to forgive yourself a little bit. It's very difficult to go through life without regrets, without making mistakes. And you can't beat yourself to death for it, because then everyone would beat themselves to death all the time. And so you think, well, I'm too soon old and too late wise, to use an old cliche. And you think, well, that's the lot of mankind. We learn things too late often, and that's too bad. And you forgive yourself because you're stupid and you don't know what you're doing, and you're unwise just like everyone else. And maybe you're somewhat capable of learning if you're careful. And then you go out and you try to foster relations and do good in the world to the degree that you can, outside of the necessity of children. And maybe you have nephews and nieces, and you can lavish some attention on them and find your substitute where you can. But I would say to forgive yourself is a big part of that. It's like, people make mistakes, man, big mistakes. And the people that I've watched through life that have been successful, it's not like they didn't make mistakes, because everyone makes mistakes, and they do things they regret, and they miss opportunities, and it's a bloody catastrophe. But they treat themselves with some degree of mercy along with the justice. It's like, yeah, well, I screwed up there, and I'm going to try to learn, and I'm not going to do it again, but I'm not going to beat myself to death so that I can't get up again. And so you do what you can to forgive yourself. It's a confusing time to live in many ways, because we have the birth control pill now, and that means reproduction has now become voluntary. Well, when's a good time to reproduce? Well, never, because who would ever think about doing that? It's so ridiculously irrational and complicated, and the burden of responsibility is so insanely high, and you're never secure enough to have the proper place to bring children into the world. And you have to get your career going and your intimate relationship, and maybe you have some struggle doing that, and one day you wake up and it's a bit late. It's like, yeah, well, you're a product of your time. And one of the prices that we're going to pay for having birth control, for having reliable contraception, is that some people are going to make the wrong decision with regards to having children. And then you view yourself as a product of your time, and that's a catastrophe, because to be a product of your time is in some ways a catastrophe. So, but there's other things to do in life, and auguring yourself into the ground with regret and self-recrimination is not useful. right? I mean, you have to learn your lesson, you have to take your lumps, all of that. But have some mercy, you know. That's it.